Chris Allingham with the Virtual Weber Bullet. If you watched my video in February, you saw how I took fat scraps from my brisket and turned it into beef tallow. If you watched my video in March, you saw how I used a single split piece of post oak instead of wood chunks when I smoked the brisket in the Smoky Mountain Cooker. Well, this month I'm going to wrap it up by showing you how I used that beef tallow when I cooked that brisket that I did with the split piece of post oak in my Weber Smokey Mountain Cooker. That brisket is a memory now, except for these little packets over here of leftover brisket that have been in the freezer. I've got brisket flat. I have brisket flat that says fatty, a little bit more fat on this one. I have some burnt ends still, and I've also got what says here brisket odds and ends. I guess this was maybe a little bit of both, but this is all that's left of that brisket that you're going to see in this video. This is a great way, by the way, to save extra brisket. I've got a two-person household, and it's difficult to eat a 15-pound brisket among two people, so this is how we do it. And if you've not tried using your food saver for leftover brisket, you know, portion out enough for like 2 sandwiches and freeze it, and it's a great way to go. So, but I digress. So, this is a method for using tallow and cooking brisket that I saw online in a video done by Meat Church. And I'm not a tallow expert. I know there's a zillion ways to use tallow when making brisket. It became all the rage in 2021. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it seems like everybody was talking about beef tallow when cooking brisket. You know, Meat Church and Mad Meat Scientist and my friend Harry Sue, all these folks went out and they were talking all about beef tallow when making brisket. And this was maybe the secret that Aaron Franklin was using to make his famous brisket down in Austin. Everybody and their brother came out of the woodwork and was talking about beef tallow and how to use it when making brisket and showing a zillion different ways of how to do it. I thought at the time, yeah, I should give that a try. And now here it is like over a year later, and I just sort of got around to doing it. So I am definitely the tortoise. I'm not the hare. But if I remember correctly, the tortoise won the race in that story. So maybe I'm a winner, not a loser. Anyway, let me show you some pictures and some video of what I did, and I will tell you how it went. Let me start off by saying that I'm not going to go into all the details of how I selected this brisket and how I trimmed it and how I seasoned it. I've done a detailed article on Central Texas brisket. I'll put the link to that in the description of this video, and you can check that out. It goes into all the details of how I did sort of a Franklin barbecue trim on a USDA prime brisket, and that's what I'm doing here. Just simply trimming it down using a simple 50-50 kosher salt and black pepper rub. Put a little mustard down first to help that rub stick to the brisket, and then cooked it roughly 275 in the Weber Smokey Mountain Cooker. Then when it had hit about 160, 165, I wrapped it in butcher paper, and this is where the tallow comes into play. So as I mentioned, there are tons of ways that you can apply beef tallow to brisket during the cooking process. I decided to follow a method that I saw in a video that was done by Meat Church. So who is Meat Church? Well, in this photo on the right is Matt Pittman. He's the owner of Meat Church Barbecue Supply in Waxahachie, Texas. He's got a storefront there in Waxahachie where he sells a bunch of his products. He's got a big online presence with an online store. He sells a really successful line of rubs with names like The Gospel, Holy Cow, Holy Voodoo, Honey Hog, and more. He's got a lot of merchandise he sells. He's got barbecue classes, and he's also got a big YouTube channel on which I found this video featuring the use of tallow. On the left is Jonny White. He's one of the co-owners of Goldee's Barbecue in Fort Worth, Texas. Goldee's Barbecue was named by Texas Monthly Magazine as the top Texas barbecue joint in 2021. This is a list they come out with every 4 years, and Goldee's came out on top. So they are the current belle of the ball in terms of Texas barbecue. Jonny began cooking barbecue at Valentina's Tex-Mex Barbecue, which is a very famous joint in South Austin. And then he found his way to the pinnacle of barbecue at Franklin Barbecue in Austin, where he learned every aspect of the business there, from manning the pits and cooking their world-famous brisket to cutting meat at the counter, preparing sides, and everything in between. So suffice it to say that Jonny knows his way around a brisket, and he knows how tallow is used by some of the best pit masters in Texas. So in this Meat Church video, beef tallow was used 3 ways. It was used at the time the brisket was wrapped in butcher paper before it went back into the cooker to finish cooking. It was used after the wrapped brisket came out of the cooker and was resting. And then it was also used at the time the brisket was sliced. When it was time to wrap the brisket in butcher paper, Jonny spritzed the paper, and then he put a big spoonful of beef tallow down on the butcher paper. He placed the brisket on top of it with the fat side down, and then he wrapped up the butcher paper, put the wrap package back in the smoker to finish cooking, taking it up to about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the brisket had finished cooking, Jonny poured warm liquid tallow over the top of the wrapped brisket on a sheet pan and let it rest until he was ready to serve it. And once the brisket had finished resting, he unwrapped it and placed it on the cutting board and poured all the accumulated fat and juices from inside the butcher paper all over that brisket before he sliced into it. So when it came time for me to wrap my brisket, I spritzed the butcher paper with a 50-50 mix of apple cider vinegar and water. I think that helps keep the brisket from sticking to the paper, and it also kind of seals the paper a little bit where the brisket touches it. Then I put a big scoop of beef tallow on the butcher paper, just like Jonny did. And then I placed my brisket fat side up on top of the tallow. And now I'm simply going to wrap up the butcher paper, ending up with that tallow side down when I'm all finished. And I'm going to move it to a baking sheet, and I moved it into a 275 degree oven where I finished it off at an internal temperature of 203 degrees Fahrenheit. So it took an hour and a half for this brisket to come up to 203 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. I took it out of the oven and I took some warm tallow, just like Jonny did in his video. I poured it all over the top of the butcher paper. Now, I don't know exactly why he did it this way, except that it probably provides kind of a seal on the paper and helps keep moisture in during the resting process. At this point, I moved it back into the oven so it could rest at a very low temperature, about 150 degrees, for a couple of hours until I was ready to slice it. And here my helper is my wife. I've taken out of the oven. You can see how wet the paper is. And I lift this out of the paper, put it onto the cutting board. And unlike Jonny, I don't drench the brisket with all of that liquid, all the fat and the jus. I set that aside. I want to save that, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why I did that later. And here I'm trying to show off the middle of my brisket. It is nice and juicy, and I've got a nice smoke ring on it, which is just the result of having kept the brisket nice and moist during the cooking process. And now this is 5 times normal speed. I'm slicing up the brisket. My slices here are a little bit thick. This is the flat. Here I'm presenting 1 slice, and we'll get you a close-up of that a little more. Here you can see a little better shot of it. You can see a lot of moisture left on the cutting board, and this was a nice moist piece of brisket. Here's another close-up shot. I was very happy with the results of how this turned out. So what was the bottom line? Well, I think the brisket was just about as good as any other brisket I'd make without tallow. So I don't really think that the bath of tallow in the bottom of the butcher paper really did a whole lot. I certainly didn't have any dry, crusty parts on the flat side of the brisket where the tallow was, but I don't always often have that anyway, and there are always some edges that are a little bit overdone and crumble, and that still was the case here. So I really can't say that the tallow did a whole lot to infuse any kind of moisture throughout the brisket. So the bottom line, tallow was kind of fun to make. It was kind of fun to use. Did it make a big difference in my brisket? I don't think so. Will I do it again? I don't think so. Should you try it? Sure, give it a try if you think it sounds like fun to you. And if you have a different experience than I had with it, go ahead and post your comment down below. Now I also want to go back and refer to that screenshot I showed you from the video where Jonny poured all of the contents of the butcher paper over his brisket on the cutting board. That is kind of a great show, you know, on a video. And it would be pretty awesome to see that on the cutting board at Franklin BBQ or at his new place, Goldee's. It would be impressive for customers, and having that fat and jus on the board would allow you to slice and then drag the slices through that before you put them onto the butcher paper and onto a customer's plate. But at home it wasn't really practical, and that's why I didn't do it. It made more sense to me to collect that jus in a bowl, and I put it in the fridge and I separated the fat from the jus. Then when I went back and served some of this brisket later, I would heat up some of the jus and put that on top of the brisket slices, and I could take some of the tallow and I could also heat that up with the brisket slices as well in an amount that made sense to me. In fact, right now, we've kept some tallow in the refrigerator. It keeps for a very, very long time. And when I reheat these slices, like I showed you earlier, that were in the little bags, I put those slices on a plate, I chip out a little piece of tallow and I put it on top. I heat it gently in the microwave at 20%, and that tallow provides a little bit of moisture that coats those brisket slices, and I think that works pretty well. But at least for me at home, I don't think it made any sense to pour all that stuff over my brisket on my cutting board before I sliced it up. I think it would have been a huge mess. And in fact, I think that in some ways the tallow can kind of mute the flavor of the brisket. It just creates you know, an oily sensation in your mouth that doesn't necessarily enhance the flavor of the brisket. So I think you want to use it sparingly to the extent that you do use it. Now, one more point before I forget. If you're not really interested in making your own tallow, but you do want to experiment with using tallow, it is available at supermarkets and at better grocery stores. You will find it at fancy grocery stores, but I found this jar at my local Walmart. So it is available in lots of places. And if you're looking for a fancy tallow, you can get a Wagyu beef tallow from Amazon.com. Well, that wraps up this video for today. I thank you for watching. I appreciate you very much. You know, if you like this video, I'd appreciate it if you would smash on the like button on YouTube. It really does help in terms of my standings on YouTube, and helps other people get recommendations to my videos. So if you do that, that'd be great. And if you'd subscribe and click on the notification button, you'll also get a notice when I put these videos out, right at the moment I put them out. So I appreciate you doing that too. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.